Minimalists.
Somebody asked me the other day, like, well, how much money did you have? At one point, I'm like, I never really had that much money at one point, like in cash. I was like, I mean, I would have maybe a couple $1 million in the bank, but I only had like maybe $600,000 in cash. And they'd be like, what? And they look at me like, did you not understand the question? You know, I'm thinking, yeah, but you got to live the rest of your life on that money,
right.
You know, or I got to get the money out of the bank. So my point is that that all that did for me was create anxiety, panic attacks, unhappiness, arrogance, anger. I mean, there were all these things. And at the time, had no clue. Didn't have a clue that bothered me. Doesn't everybody have panic attacks every couple of weeks? Doesn't everybody not be able to sleep? You know, don't you have to lay in bed for 2 hours before you eventually pass out? Don't you have to take a Xanax to go to sleep?
Oh,
that's
wow.
crazy. What do you mean you just fall asleep like that? What do you mean? That's crazy. So there's all these things that to me was just regular life.
Yeah.
And so eventually when I did so I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, you know, maybe I live out the rest of my life and it's amazing. I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think I live out the rest of my life. Maybe I don't get caught. Maybe I do. I think I'm so arrogant that eventually I would have told somebody else and they would have caught up with me.
Yeah.
Listen, there's hundreds of thousands of law enforcement people looking for you. You're going to get caught.
Right.
So, but I think what happened was I got arrested. I went to prison. I had 2 panic attacks when I was in prison. 2. And they were literally, as opposed to the panic attacks on the street where I literally stopped and if there was nothing to sit down, I would have dropped on the ground in an Indian style and just sit there. I've done that before in a supermarket because I was in the middle of the aisle. There was no place to sit. I literally sat down. People are walking by like, what's with this guy?
Wow.
Because it was just overwhelming. And it only lasts a minute or two, but it's not a good minute. And so in prison I had 2 where I'm walking along and literally I kind of like stopped and I could feel the tingle, took a couple breaths and it was over and I kept walking. And I got 26 years. That's the most stress. That's what it caught up with me. So, you know, what happened was eventually I start writing. And when I start writing my fellow inmates' stories and I start writing my story, you know, and you start looking into yourself and reading books about how to write and how to write a memoir and all of the things that I would have told you meant nothing. You know, suddenly you start looking at yourself and looking at your past and looking at what those catalysts are that cause you to do certain things. And, you know, it starts unraveling. And I very quickly realized that you are a narcissist. You are arrogant. You are these things. You are, this isn't the media. This isn't bullshit. This is what's happening, and this is just who you are.
Yes.
And it's horrible, and it's a bad situation, and you need to start working on it. And although I feel like I work on it all the time, I think I told you this. I feel horrible for like friends of mine, because I just dominate conversations. I have friends that literally they'll be talking for a couple of minutes and then they'll say something. I'll go, oh man, that reminds me of my ex-wife. They go, whoa. We're talking about me right now. Give me 5 more minutes and we're going to talk about you the rest of lunch. And you would think if that happened to you, you would think that people would get upset about that. But I'm always like, I'm so glad you did that.
Yeah.
Because I dominate conversations. I will come in, I will dominate the conversation. I will walk away 20 minutes later and I don't know a thing about you. And that's just an asshole. You're just an asshole.
Well, so here's the difference, I think. And by the way, here's how Matt Cox is Ryan Nicodemus or is Josh Milburn or is anyone else who's listening to this, I think. You began to discover some things about yourself and naming those things and realizing that's not the person that you wanted to be. Ryan and I, we grew up really poor, thought the key to happiness was to make a lot of money in our 20s.
Right.
And so we climbed the corporate ladder. And by age 30, we were living the American dream. But we weren't the people that we wanted to be either. We were jerks. We had addiction problems. We had consumption problems. We had a lot of problems, and we covered it up because of the ostensible success. And yours, you were very successful in one way. I mean, you were.
It certainly appeared to be.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's where we are. And so quite often there's one small compromise. That's why I started the podcast with this. Small compromise of your values. Usually it's because we don't even know what our values are. At the time, you're like, I just need some money. And so, okay, I'm willing to make this one small compromise. But then, of course, that one small compromise leads to 2 to 6 to 20 to $1.3 million in Tampa or whatever it is, right? And all of a sudden, you're like, how did I get here? Well, it was one bad decision at a time.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about redemption, I think the difference of the Matt Cox of yesteryear versus the Matt Cox of today doesn't mean you figured everything out. Ryan and I certainly haven't figured everything out, but you have figured something out. And it's that the life you were living before was not a meaningful life.
Right.
In fact, it was the opposite of that. It was causing immense stress and discontent, and it may have been sexy. You could make a great movie out of it, right? But like, you can't actually make a good movie out of the real contented people. The most contented people I know, like we're going to have Leo Babauta on here, probably the most contented person I've ever met.
Yeah.
The movie of his life would suck.
Yeah.
Because there's no drama.
Right.
You don't want drama in your real life. It's great on that glowing screen.
Right.
It's great in your book. And it's great that you've gotten past it. And what I'm seeing now with Matt Cox, and I can see it, I'm looking toward the horizon here. And I'll just say this. I want to acknowledge you. I'm proud of you, man.
Amen.
Like the direction that you've moved in, like I can see this really developing into a meaningful life. And so
it already has. I mean,
Yeah.
it already has.
Yeah.
Amen.
So, I mean, it just has. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you're wrapping it up, but I was saying, like, when I was in prison, I have a friend named Pete who's there for this is going to sound horrible. He's there for conspiracy to murder 2 confidential informants that were murdered.
Oh, wow.
Didn't do it.
Just like everyone else in prison.
Well, nice. Actually wrote a book about him. He's the nicest guy you've ever met, and super knows who he is. And I remember talking to him one time, and we were talking, and we were talking about somebody else, and I was like, "Why does he act like that?" And he goes, "I mean, he just hadn't figured it out yet." And I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Well, I mean, you can't come to prison and continue to behave the way you did prior to prison." He goes, "and then leave prison and expect not to return." And he goes, "You have to come here, you have to figure out who you are and what you're meant to do, and you have to do that and leave prison." He goes, "You'll be okay." And I said, "Have I figured?" I said, "Well, I need to figure that." He goes, I need to figure that out." And he goes, No, you figured it out." And I went, "Doing what?" He goes, "Writing."
Yeah.
And so it was funny because after that conversation, people would say, "What are you going to do when you get out?" And I was like, "I'm going to figure out how to make money just being me."